Special thanks to Melissa Azam, Judge Tim Bryan, Ubaldo Moraz, and Prithvi Mudana. Hosted by Jeremy Flowers and Nell Spencer.
Welcome to Barrier Breakers, Building Communities and Connecting the Dots, episode 12. I'm Jeremy Flowers, Director of Coordinated Community Response at the East Texas Crisis Center.
I'm Nell Spencer, the Director of Outreach and Education at the Women's Center of East Texas.
And June is Men's Health Month.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about the impact of intimate partner violence and sexual assault on men. And, what that looks like and what services are available to men and what you can do if you're a man to reach out.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important that we kind of say domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking also touches men as well. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about those topics, it's always related to a female survivor. But there are male survivors, and although the percentage, I guess, to women survivors is a lot lower, we want to honor that space for men who have experienced abuse, whether it is in childhood or in adulthood, domestic violence, sexual assault, or trafficking.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to touch on that point in childhood, because a lot of adult men report being sexually abused when they were a child, right? In fact, I think, there's a whole nonprofit organization around the statistic 1 in 6.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look up 1in6.org, that they provide services to men who were sexually abused as boys. And there's stigma around men speaking out about being sexually assaulted, in particular, also, being victims of intimate partner domestic violence. But, like you said, there's resources available. The Women's Center of East Texas, the East Texas Crisis Center, national organizations as well. And, while speaking out can be difficult, that doesn't diminish your manhood.
Right.
I just want to say that as a man, like, that vulnerable space is uncomfortable. It can be challenging to venture into, but it doesn't make you less of a man if you've been a victim or survivor of intimate partner violence or sexual assault.
Absolutely. And I think that that's such an important thing to say all the time when we're talking about this type of stuff is it doesn't make you less of a man if this stuff has happened to you. And I think that kind of idea or that stigma around their manhood keeps them quiet. And that only ends up creating things like depression and anxiety and PTSD and failed relationships. And so, a lot of the times, if we can bring to light the traumatic events we've experienced and work through them, we can go on to have relatively healthy relationships in the future. And I think that that's so important to vocalize, because as scary and as hard as it might be to say this has happened to me, it's also kind of scary to think like, well, if I keep quiet, then what will the rest of my relationships be in the future?
Right. And then, on top of that, what type of unhealthy coping skills am I developing because of this unresolved issue that I just continue to stuff down or avoid or suck it up because that's what real men do?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the statistic. And so, the CDC says that most men who have experienced assault experience their first assault before the age of 25. And so that is, your brain's not even fully developed by 25, and yet you're having to deal with very heavy real life things, a lot of the times as children. So, Jeremy, as a man, you've mentioned coming and getting services, but let's talk about kind of like manhood and what that looks like for survivors. We talked a little bit about the stigma of saying their truth, speaking their truth, but have you ever run into survivors who are men who have said like, oh yeah, I've never said this because of X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just really, a lot of times I've had men speak out, and, when they speak out, they may not identify it as I haven't spoke out because of the way I was socialized, but I think, at the root of it, that's what was there. And, typically when I hold discussion groups with men, or I go speak to a room full of men, I have a lot of conversations with men after the training or the group has concluded and most people have left.
Yeah.
Because men as a whole, we foster and maintain the norms of masculinity. So there's almost a code of silence that helps perpetuate those norms. And whether those norms are problematic behavior or whether those norms keep us from speaking out, right? Because if I'm in a room full of men and I express some sort of vulnerability, like I've been sexually assaulted, then the way I've been conditioned is going to either allow me to do that or prevent me from doing that. So if for some reason I think by telling this room full of men that I've been sexually assaulted, they're all going to look at me as less of a man, that I'm not going to say that, right? And then, going back to the traumatic experience in itself is a vulnerable space to navigate. So I think men, we're supposed to always put on this show, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say it, masculinity is a performance. We're performing mostly, right? And like I was alluding to previously, we're mostly performing for other men since that's who gauges our status as men and our manhood. So we don't want to look weak, but society has told me if this happens to me, then I am weak, right? Society has told me that if I show emotions, then I'm also weak and or I'm feminine. And so we kind of, in some sense, not in a whole sense, but in some sense, we've conditioned boys to avoid being what is perceived as feminine, which is showing emotion. We've conditioned them to not express vulnerability. And so when you socialize this idea of manhood that keeps boys guarded, what that does is also make them insecure. And so everything I do now is being graded, and I have to prove, whether real or not, whether real or imagined, to all of these other men that I'm just as manly as them, if I'm not more manly.
Yeah, that sounds exhausting.
Yeah, it is. It is. And so especially in those male-dominated spaces, expressing vulnerability, like, man, I was sexually assaulted as a child. That's strength. That is incredible strength to just be vulnerable, right? Because if I'm to be vulnerable with you, then I have to give you something that you can use against me. And so to say that, and not just in a room full of men, to say that to someone you've never said it to before, right? If you've never told anyone that as a man I was, abused in my last relationship, as a man, I was sexually assaulted as a child, to say that for the first time, that takes an incredible amount of strength.
Right. And so much courage, too.
Absolutely. And so all that to say, like, there's support there for men, right? And that's what we're here for, each of our agencies are here for, but that's also what we want to bring attention to, raise awareness around, that, counseling just shows you want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Going to counseling doesn't mean something's wrong with you. And that's one of the things, is typically associated with someone going to counseling. Well, what's wrong with them?
Mm-hmm.
And when we should ask, well, what happened to them?
Right.
And so I think, we really, as a society, need to help empower men to take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Not just if you've been sexually assaulted or experienced domestic violence, but as a man, take care of yourself, right? And what does that look like? And we got to normalize these conversations.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say take care of yourself, because when we're talking to women who are survivors, we say take care of yourself so that you can be the best version of yourself for maybe your children or for whomever. And I think that is the same statement for men. Is men need to take care of themselves in this way so that they can be the best version of themselves for maybe their children or their friends or whomever it is that they're in relationship with. It is not just a female thing that you have to take care of yourself, but it is a man thing. Take care of yourself so that you can be the best version of yourself wherever you go. And, you said, what's wrong with you, but then also, why can't they handle this? And I think that that's such a damning statement, because it's not, I can't handle this, but because asking for help is not saying I can't handle this on my own. It's saying I need the tools that maybe I don't have so that I can handle this to the best of my ability. And I think when we kind of restructure how we think about asking for help, it takes away the I'm not a man, or I'm not strong enough, or whatever it is that's keeping people from seeking assistance.
Yeah. And so, just reframing how we commonly look at men reaching out to admit they need some sort of help, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got this.
Right.
I don't need to do this. I'll do it. I don't need your help.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't need directions. I'll find it. So I think, and so, and what that looks like, it might not sound manly, but having a safe space, because being able to share your truth is healing in itself. And so having that safe space where you can be your authentic self, and encouraging the men in our lives to let them know that it's okay to share. And it's okay to share with someone else. But as long as you share, as long as, you can have that self-awareness to, like you were saying there, that mindfulness to acknowledge that, hey, I don't have the tools, but I need the tools. I want to get the tools. That's a, like you also said, a courageous act.
Yeah. And I think it's important to also highlight that if you are in an intimate partner relationship, I think the statistic is like 1 in 3 men who are experiencing violence are in an intimate partner, or that's by their intimate partner. And I think that's so important to highlight, because it's not just men who perpetrate. Like, women can be perpetrators as well. I think it's important for people to know that, again, violence is a choice that your partner is making. Sometimes people say, well, I was abused as a child, or, maybe they experienced this as a child, and so now as an adult, they're just reenacting what they've experienced. And so maybe they don't know better. But that is hogwash. Violence is a choice, whether it's coming from a male or a female. Not every relationship that perpetrator is going to have is going to be violent. And so when they come home and they choose to be violent against their spouse or their husband or their partner, that's a choice that that person is actively making.
And it's equally as important to let men know that resources are available. I don't know if you've experienced this, but one of the most common questions that I get when I'm out in the community is, do y'all provide services to men?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
We provide counseling, we provide advocacy. If a man's in need of emergency shelter, we will refer out for that specific service. But we provide all of the same services, excluding emergency shelter, for men as we do for women.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. I was just in a meeting with a bunch of community members, other agencies, and I, introduced myself, and I say, we serve survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking, men, women, and children. And 98% of the people in the room said, oh, I didn't know you served men. And that was such a sad statement for me, because we do serve men, and we do provide emergency shelter for them as well. And so if a man comes to our agency seeking services, whether that's just counseling or advocacy or emergency shelter, we will provide all of the same services we provide for the female survivors to the male survivors as well.
Yeah, so if you're a man listening to this and you've experienced sexual assault, intimate partner violence, know that help is available. If you're a man and you know another man, feel free to share resources with them, encourage them to reach out if they feel comfortable with it. But one of the things we ought not do is insinuate that men are somehow less manly if they acknowledge that they've experienced violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the complete opposite. But I'm not a man. I can't speak for that, or that pressure that society says I can't be vulnerable. But when we share our deepest, darkest secrets, we are being the strongest version of ourselves, the most courageous, the most, I think, valuable to society. Because when people lead by example, other people follow. And if more men said, I'm going to therapy, or I think that's totally cool that you're doing that, I guarantee you men and boys would follow that modeled behavior.
Yeah, and we can change that culture.
Yeah.
That's the good thing about that, right? Because that is just a social norm. That means that can change.
Mm-hmm.
So we as men collectively can work to foster a culture where men care for themselves, where we encourage other men to take care of themselves. And that's whether you've experienced violence or not.
Yeah.
So I think, June being Men's Health Month, one of the biggest things we can do as men is take care of ourselves, especially if we've experienced violence. Go to the doctor, go engage in some form of self-care, whatever that looks like for you. Talk to someone, talk to a friend, reach out.
Yeah. It starts with that phone call. I think for both of our agencies is pick up the phone. You can, if you don't feel comfortable sharing your personal information, like your name, you can call anonymously and you can have a conversation with a trained advocate about what potential steps you could make. Start there. If telling your story out to other people is scary, start with that phone call, and just see what your options are. Because it is a huge deal, and I think that it's okay for us to acknowledge that. I think that society has made it a big deal for men to be vulnerable, and for you to pick up that phone and call us and say, "Hey, this is what happened." That's a big deal, and we want to celebrate that with you, because you are choosing your health and your future relationships. And that's really cool. And so I want to applaud all the men who have done that, all the men thinking about doing it, because it can be scary. And I think that that's okay to say.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. We got to learn to be realistic.
Yeah.
And one of the ways we do that is acknowledging when we're scared,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how uncomfortable it may make us.
Yeah.
So.
And positive, healthy change doesn't come from taking the easy way out. It doesn't come from doing the same things you've done over and over and over again that aren't working. Positive, healthy change comes from being scared and doing the scary things. And this is scary, so it's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you or someone you know are a man and have experienced intimate partner, domestic violence, sexual assault, if you know someone who's also a man and you want to encourage them that there's resources and help available, you can reach out to the East Texas Crisis Center at 903-595-5591.
Or you can call the Women's Center of East Texas at 800-441-5555.
See you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Barrier Breakers, building communities and connecting the dots.